Hello and welcome to Topic 1, Lecture 2. And in this lecture, we're going to be learning about the key features of a democracy. So what are we going to be covering in this lecture? Well, first we're going to look at how democracy is more than just a definition. Other factors need to be included or present in a democracy for democracy to actually be a democracy. And so some of those factors are political knowledge. The citizenry must have knowledge about the political workings of the country. A concept called political efficacy, which we'll define in a moment, and that government needs to be responsive to what the people want. In other words, responsive to the will of the people. And then we're going to be thinking critically about each of these components. So let's go ahead and get started. So I like to start the lecture on democracy with this picture. And in the center of that picture might be an individual that you are familiar with. That is the leader of North Korea, Kim Jong-un, also just known as the Supreme Leader. And I like to show this picture because, the country, North Korea, its official name is the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, okay? And so you see these words republic, which we talked about in the last lecture, and the words democratic, okay, which indicates that it's a democracy. But as we all know, North Korea is far from a democracy. I mean, for all practical purposes, it's somewhere between an authoritarian and totalitarian regime, probably, bending more towards totalitarian. And I love this picture because it has the supreme leader in the middle, and then he is visiting a family from North Korea, and they're all clustered around him. And then there is an official government overseer on the side. And you look at the expressions on their face, and it's kind of hard to figure out. They don't look happy. They're either overly thrilled because the supreme leader is there, or they're scared because if they're not seeming thrilled enough, who knows what might happen to them. And so I show this because just because you call your country a democracy doesn't make it a democracy. There are other components that must be present for a country to actually be a democracy. So we're going to look at three components that are necessary components of a democracy. This isn't an exhaustive list. There are other elements that need to be present in a democracy, and we'll be talking about those throughout the course of the semester, but I just wanted to focus on these three in this lecture. Now, in the last lecture, we defined democracy as popular sovereignty. In other words, that the entity that has the ultimate authority in that government is the people. The political authority ultimately rests in the hands of the people. And we learned in the last lecture that, we're a republican form, a republic, a representative form of democracy, where that ultimate authority rests with the people because we have the right to vote. We vote to elect our leaders. They implement policies. And if we don't like the job they do, we then choose somebody else. Okay. So we know that is how a democracy is defined. However, that in itself is not enough. I mean, if the political authority ultimately rests with the people have to be able to engage in governance. And one of the things that they have to be ready to do is that they have to have political knowledge that they can use in their decision making in terms of what policies to support and have the political knowledge to know that if we elect these leaders, these are the policies that they're likely to enact, okay? And so a democracy has to be filled with individuals that have political knowledge, or it is just a sham, right? If the people are not knowledgeable and they're not active, then you say rule of the people, it doesn't mean much because people don't know anything about politics and they also don't actively get involved in politics. Another important component of a democracy is a concept called political efficacy, and we're also going to be talking about trust in government as well. Political efficacy is it's defined as a feeling that your voice or your actions make a difference, that your voice is listened to those in government, that you trust that they are going to listen to you and take your opinion and your vote into consideration when making decisions. It's also this sense that the people who govern over us are sort of like us, that they understand our concerns, that they understand the lives that we lead. So we'll take a look at that in more detail in a moment. And then finally, an important component for a democratic society is that government has to listen to what the people want. Okay, it needs to be responsive to the will of the people. So let's look at each of these separately. Okay, so when it comes to political knowledge, political knowledge is defined in your textbook as people that live in a country possessing information about the formal institutions of government, political actors, and political issues. So if you were going to measure someone's level of political knowledge, you would ask them questions about our governmental institutions. You might ask them, what are the three federal branches of government? You might ask them about political actors. Do you know who the president is, the vice president, the speaker of the House? Can you name one of the members of the Supreme Court? And also you would expect them to know about particular rights that are granted to people in the United States, as well as common and important political issues. You'd expect them to know that about the economy, that the inflation is on the rise. You might know about political issues like abortion and abortion rights, or political issues regarding climate change, whatever the hot topics are. So when you think about political knowledge, and if you were measuring it, that those are some of the things that you may look at. Now, keep in mind that just because somebody has a belief about politics doesn't mean that that's an example or an illustration of political knowledge. A lot of people believe things politically, believe things to be true about our country, but that doesn't make it political knowledge. That political knowledge is fact-based. It is not opinion-based, okay? So when you're measuring political knowledge, you're not asking people about what their beliefs are. That's public opinion. But we're asking people, what do they know about government? So a good example of an opinion-based versus fact-based when it comes to knowledge about government, is I teach a class on about the politics and the criminal justice system in the spring. And, at the beginning of the semester, we sort of talk about causes of crime. What causes crime? And one of the things that I sometimes get from students is that the reason we have crime in the United States is because we have a lot of immigrants. And the belief that undocumented immigrants or illegal aliens are the ones who contribute to the high level of crime in the United States. Well, that's an opinion that some people hold, but that's not based in fact. In fact, recent research done by the University of Wisconsin in Madison demonstrates that undocumented people in the United States have the lowest level of both being charged with the crime and being convicted of the crime. That people who are here either as legal immigrants or as natural born citizens, they have a much higher crime commission rate than do undocumented immigrants, okay? So it's a good example of the difference between a fact and an opinion. But opinions, that can be sort of calling into question a democracy. If people are taking political action based not on facts, but on opinions, particularly if those opinions don't match up with the facts, that could, sort of call into question the soundness of a democratic nation. And so these are important because democracies depend on political engagement, but that engagement needs to be fact-based. It needs to be enlightened political engagement. Hey, speaking of political knowledge, maybe now's a good time to test yourself. I know a lot of you are taking this class in order to get more political knowledge, but hey, it doesn't hurt to have a little test your knowledge where we stand right now at the beginning of the semester. So I'll put the questions up here, and then you can pause the video and you can write down what you think the answers are, and then I'll show you what the answers are on the next slide. So can you name the three branches of federal government? What is the Bill of Rights? What are the 5 liberties that are listed in the First Amendment? Can you name them? Can you name as many as you can? How many judges are on the Supreme Court? And heck, for bonus, can you name one of the Supreme Court justices? Okay, take a moment, answer, and I'll be right back. Hey, welcome back. So how did you do? Well, can you name the 3 branches of the federal government? They are the legislative, executive, and judicial branch. Those are the 3 branches in the United States government. What is the Bill of Rights? Well, the Bill of Rights are the first 10 amendments to the United States Constitution. That's what we call the Bill of Rights. There are 27 amendments to the Constitution, and the first 10 were added soon after the Constitution was ratified. We'll learn more about that this semester. There are 5 liberties in the First Amendment. What are they? So hopefully you can get a few of them. If you get all 5, awesome. So freedom of speech, freedom to exercise your religion and also to be free from government establishing religion. Press, freedom of the press. Freedom to assemble with others, join a political party or just assemble peaceably. And petition the government for redress of grievances. So if you have a problem, you have a right to ask the government to address that problem. And then how many judges are on the Supreme Court? Well, today there are 9 judges on the Supreme Court, but there's nothing in the Constitution that establishes the number of Supreme Court justices. The number is not in the Constitution. It's up to the Congress of the United States, the legislative branch, to determine how many justices will sit on the Supreme Court. And that number has changed over time, but it's set right now and has been for quite some time at 9, although there's rumblings about increasing the size of the court, as you might have heard. And bonus, can you name one of the Supreme Court justices? You got Chief Justice Roberts, Thomas, Clarence Thomas, Samuel Alito, Sonia Sotomayor, Elena Kagan, Gorsuch, Neil Gorsuch, forgot his first name, Brett Kavanaugh, Amy Coney Barrett, and the newly added justice who replaced Stephen Breyer this summer, Ketanji Brown Jackson. Now, if you can name one of the Supreme Court justices, you're ahead of most of the rest of Americans. In a 2018 C-SPAN poll of likely voters, while 92% of likely voters said that the Supreme Court decisions have great impact on their life, only less than a majority of Americans could name one Supreme Court justice. 52% of people could not name even one. So you can rate yourself accordingly. So we've actually seen some improvements in political knowledge recently. And your textbook has some information about measuring political knowledge. It's a little bit out of date, so I thought I'd just give you some, more up-to-date information. Every year, the Annenberg School of Public Policy, they put on Constitution Day, which marks the ratification of the United States Constitution on September 17th, they put out a civics survey. And it measures knowledge, people's knowledge of politics. And we've seen some improvements recently. In particular, we've seen an improved knowledge of individual rights, that it used to be that 37% of Americans, and so in 2017, 37% of Americans couldn't name any of the 5 rights that's listed in the First Amendment. But today, only 17% of people can't name any of the rights. So that's a really good improvement. People are more aware of what's in the First Amendment. We've also seen an increase in those able to identify all 3 branches of government. And so today, 56% of people in the United States can identify all 3 branches of the federal government, and that's up from 39% in 2019. So while we have seen some recent improvements in political knowledge in the United States, we still have some room to go and some cause for concerns. And this information comes from the Annenberg Civics survey. So nearly half of Americans still can't name all 3 branches of government. It's a little concerning. It's something you would think you would learn in elementary school, if not high school. Only 1/3 of the people know the congressional terms of office. So when you ask people what the term of office is for a member of the House of Representatives, only 1/3 of the people know that it's 2 years, and only 1/3 of the people know that a term of office for the Senate is 6 years. That's a little bit concerning. Regarding recent events and knowledge of whether or not those actions are constitutional, nearly 50% of people believe that invading the Capitol on January 6, 2021 that nearly 50% believe that invading the Capitol to stop the certification of electoral votes, that's a constitutionally protected act. And that is not a constitutionally protected act. That you can engage in peaceable assembly, but you cannot engage in violent assembly. And that also interesting that 60% of people who took the Civics survey believe that the First Amendment applies to social networks like Twitter and Facebook. As you'll learn in this class, that the First Amendment applies only to the actions of government. And last I checked, although who knows now, Twitter and Facebook are not government agents and actors. So just some, information about how we may still improve in terms of our political knowledge. So let's think a little bit critically about this improvement in increases in political knowledge. So what do you think is a potential cause for the increase in political knowledge from 2017 till 2021? When I taught this class last year, I mean, we're continuing to see improvements from 2020 to 2021. That's the last time this survey had been taken. There'll be a new one coming up soon. It could be that, maybe it's an upside of political polarization. People are a lot more invested in politics today. And while that leads to a lot of negative things, a lot of conflict and, ill will towards people who aren't in your political tribe, it could lead to people getting more engaged and getting more information. Do you think this is a trend? I mean, so if, let's say, political polarization reduces, do you think political knowledge will go down? Or do you think is this an indication that people are maybe getting a better understanding of American government and politics? Do you think Americans will continue to improve their political knowledge? Or is it a response to a specific circumstance? Nearly half can't name the three branches of government. 50% of people don't know that press freedom is in the First Amendment. Is that a cause for concern? And just more broadly, is lack of political knowledge something that we can be concerned about? Is it a sign of a weakness within our democracy? Let's now turn our sights to the second element for a democratic society, which is political efficacy. And so what political efficacy is, it's a belief. It's the belief that you can influence what government does. In other words, that your voice actually matters. If you've taken a psychology class, you might be familiar with the concept of efficacy, because that it's sometimes used in terms of personal efficacy. Some people feel like, that when they look at their life, that they can make a difference, that they can change their life. If they don't like the direction that their life's going in, they can make changes, they can make a difference in terms of improving their life. That means that they have a high sense of personal efficacy. Other people think that they're trapped, that they basically don't think that changes that they make will make a difference, and they feel helpless, that they can't change their life. Political efficacy is not personal efficacy, but it's similar. It's basically a belief that you can have an impact on politics. The higher your sense of political efficacy, the more you think that your voice matters. The lower your sense of political efficacy, you feel like government's not listening to you and your actions don't make a difference. So if you have a high level of political efficacy, you might not only write a letter to Congress, but you might think that writing a letter to a member of to your representative or senator, that it can make a difference, that they'll read it, listen to it, and it might influence their decision making. People attend rallies, and that they think that attending to rallies raises awareness and can make change. Coming out of the murder of George Floyd and the protests and rallies that took place after his death, that there were actual changes, in terms of policies regarding use of force. So it could possibly be that people who attended those rallies really feel like things are different this time and the government is listening. However, we still see, instances of police brutality. It's going to come as no surprise to you that political efficacy in the United States is low. So let's look at some information that supports that claim. So here's some research that the Pew Center did on the issue of political efficacy. They asked people about elected officials, and that, as you can see there, 77% of people feel like elected officials lose touch with their people that they're representing quickly. A much lower percentage said that they feel that elected officials try to stay in contact with the people they're representing. 74% said that they didn't think elected officials cared about what people like me think, and 74 said that they put their own interests, elected officials put their own interests first. All of that is an indication of a low sense of political efficacy. Basically, people don't think that their elected officials listen to them. This slide is also from the Pew Research Center, and it shows how the people's beliefs about elected officials not caring about them, it's grown over time. And so the dark, let me put on my magic pen here. Okay, there we go. So this dark line up here is basically saying that elected officials don't care about what people like me think. And you look at from 1994 to the latest data that they have is from 2015, you see that there's a growing increase in people feeling like elected officials don't care about them, and that you see a decrease in the number of people who think that elected officials do care about them. So political efficacy is low, and it's continuing to get lower. So another important feature of political efficacy is the idea that people in a democracy trust government to do the right thing. And this is a graph that shows over time since the 1950s about people's attitudes about trust in government. And so let me put my magic pen on here. So the polling question is that, they ask people, do you trust the government in Washington, D.C. to do what is right always, most of the time, sometimes, rarely, or never? And this brown line here is basically showing the people who said, yes, they always trust government to do what's right, or most of the time trust government to do what is right. Okay, so always or most of the time. And you can see that in the 1950s that 70% of people said that, yeah, they trust government to do what's right always or most of the time. And you can just see that it's gone lower and lower, a little bit up there, right around 9/11, right? You want to trust government because, we were under attack. But it's been plummeting ever since and kind of crashing. It's been kind of in the low 20s. Today, it's about 20% of Americans trust government to do what is right all the time or most of the time. And so we see, again, another element that's kind of concerning regarding democracy. So some things to think about regarding political efficacy. So which do you think is more concerning? A lack of political knowledge or low levels of trust and efficacy? Obviously, not having political knowledge and not having trust and efficacy is concerning. But, is it better to have a populace that's well informed? Does being well informed mean that you are more aware about what your government's doing and that you might have a higher level of trust and efficacy? Some studies do show that the higher educated you are, the greater amount of trust you have in your government, and also you have a higher level of efficacy. That could just be that you're more informed about. It's easy to not trust something you don't know anything about, but the more you know, then you actually understand like the complexities of democracy. But just something to think about. Think also about what impact does low political efficacy and lack of trust in government have on maintaining a democratic society, right? That democracy is popular sovereignty. If people don't trust government, they might just be likely to check out and not pay attention. If they're not paying attention, then that kind of opens the door for the abuse of power. Maybe think about, is democracy threatened by low trust, low efficacy? What are the impacts for democratic society? Okay, the last thing that we're going to look at is the idea that democratic governments need to be responsive to the will of the people. Because if democracy is where the people are sovereign, and particularly our kind of democracy where we don't have a direct democracy, but we elect people, and then the people we elect should reflect what the people want. And so it's really important that we have mechanisms in place to make sure that the will of the people is properly represented to those who are governing over us. And so it's important that we have an accurate system for determining the will of the people, that elections need to be free and fair. They also need to have, obviously you need to have election integrity, because if you can't trust elections and you think they're fraudulent, then people aren't going to participate in elections. later in the semester, despite all the claims of election fraud and lack of integrity in our election system, election fraud is extraordinarily rare in the United States. And so, we need to have free and fair elections. We also need to make sure that people have access to the ballot and that there aren't barriers to preventing people from voting. We also need to be able to let people speak freely and to have a press that is fact-based and giving people correct information. We need to have the freedom to associate with others that we agree politically with, because it's through freedom of speech, it's through freedom of press, and it's through freedom of association that the will of the people can be expressed. That it's important that in a democracy, the will of the people isn't that we just listen to some people, but we listen to all people. And that is a fundamental principle of pluralism that you're going to be reading about in the textbook. And so pluralism is that you have the freedom to speak and you have the freedom to associate and join interest groups and political parties. And then you have like a competition among those ideas, right? So the free marketplace of ideas, people present their ideas freely, and then we decide which ideas are true and logical, and which are the ones that should, govern the people that rule us, right? And so that we need to make sure that all interests have the right to compete for influence in the government, and that we don't shut down the viewpoints of some. But we also have to keep in mind that within that competition, that there has to be room for compromise and moderation. Democracies don't work if it's my way or the highway, right? So pluralism is saying that, that at the end of the day, when somebody wins an election, then you respect their right to govern. If you have an interest group that has more power and they're doing it along legal means, then if they influence, the outcomes of elections, then we have to say that that is fair. Of course, we will be talking about sort of how sometimes that influence is unfair. So, we'll be thinking critically about that throughout the course of the semester. And then finally, when we're talking about that the will of the people, we want to make sure that that the will of the people is that the majority rules and that decisions are made that reflect what the majority, 50% plus one of the people want. But we'll be learning this semester, and you'll be reading your textbook about that the rights of those that aren't in the minority viewpoint, okay, or the rights of those who aren't in the majority viewpoint, that their rights need to be protected as well. And that's where compromise comes in. You might have the majority to pass a bill, but you might want to take into consideration what those who are not in the majority, what their desires are as well, so that you can make decisions within a democracy that really impact and improve the lives of not just a majority, but a super majority of the people that are living in the United States or in any democracy. So, as we talked on the last slide, that in a democracy, it's important to have mechanisms in place to know what the will of the people is. Free and fair elections, that people have the right to freely speak and to associate with like-minded people. We also know that everybody has a right to freely compete in the marketplace of ideas and interest groups, and that while majority rules, that the interests of the minority should also be taken into consideration when enacting laws. But, in the United States, at least recently, what the majority of Americans want often is not reflected in the law, right? Leading some people to wonder, why isn't it that the will of the people isn't being reflected in laws? And here's just some examples of the majority of what people want, but how that hasn't been reflected in, at least not at the federal level. So according to Pew poll in April of 21, 60% of Americans support legalization of medical and recreational marijuana. So that's like more than just 50% plus one. But last I checked, marijuana is still a Schedule I narcotic. It's still illegal at the federal level. So the will of the people isn't getting reflected at the federal level on that. When it comes to abortion rights, that 85% of people think that abortion should be legal in certain circumstances. So that's 50% think that abortion should be legal in certain circumstances. or 35% in all, adding up to 85. And that's from a Gallup poll in 2022. And that's been pretty consistent over time. But as we know, the Supreme Court just, took away the constitutional right to an abortion, allowing states to make it illegal. And so, again, the will of the people is not necessarily being reflected at the federal level. 61% of people support getting rid of the Electoral College, and that is from from Gallup polling, and that 73% support federal investment in paid family leave from a CBS.YouGov poll. Okay, so those are some pretty big numbers. Okay, 60% support legalization of medical and recreational marijuana. 85 think abortion should be legal. 61% support getting rid of the Electoral College. 73% want there to be federal investment in paid family leave. But none of these laws, as we know, have been passed. And the question is why? We'll be talking about that through the course of the semester. But for the Electoral College, we'd have to amend the Constitution. Very hard to do that. We have, in our Congress that you have to have a supermajority to get things through the Senate because of the filibuster. And, also because of gerrymandering, which we'll be learning about, that oftentimes that the majority of the people doesn't get reflected in particular congressional districts. So there are reasons why, but that is one of the challenges that we're facing in American government today. And so in conclusion, as we started this lecture, we saw that labeling your country a democracy easy, but actually creating and maintaining a democracy with the components and factors necessary for what defines a country as a democracy is much more challenging and difficult. It takes participation, work, and dedication to maintain this democratic experiment. And that when we see things such as low political knowledge, low political efficacy, low trust, and the ways in which what the people want aren't getting enacted or reflected in those who are representing us, particularly at the federal level, it raises some concern, and we may need to ask ourselves, what can we do to increase trust, to increase political efficacy, to increase knowledge, and to make sure that what the people want is actually reflected in our laws. We're going to be digging into this more next week as we begin to look at the documents and values that are the foundation of this experiment. And so we'll sort of, be taking a look at the founding and the founding documents. Thank you so much for listening, and I will talk to you again soon.